Hi, my name is Jake Vossenkemper, Director of Agronomy and Research here at Liqui-Grow.
Hi, I'm Katie Hess, Director of Sales and Marketing here at Liqui-Grow. Dr. Jake, with this nice weather that we're having, I've had some people ask about soil sampling, grid sampling. So should we be doing it this time of the year? What's your thoughts on composite samples versus grid samples?
All right, Katie, so this subject could be an entire 30-minute Lead Academy discussion on its own. And I would ask the viewers, if you want to hear a much more in-depth discussion about this, please suggest it in the comments, and that can be something we do in the future.
Yeah, we can.
But in brief, if there's a reason to go ahead and take grid samples this spring, by all means, sure. I think the one thing to keep in mind is if you typically sample in the fall, it's a good idea to stick with sampling in the fall. But if there's a reason to sample in the spring, go ahead and start sampling in the spring. Just know that when you change, you want to continue sampling in the fall or the spring. Okay, so that's the important point. But if you want to sample in the spring, there are some advantages to sampling in the spring, right? We talked about
Right.
that.
For me, the advantage is having that information back in your hands when fertilizer plans start to be made in late summer, early summer, so that we're ready to go when the fall happens and we're not waiting around on samples to come back because you got a guy waiting there to do tillage, but we can't do the tillage because we don't have the fertilizer on because we're still waiting for the samples.
Yes. So there are definitely some logistical advantages to doing sampling in the spring. It gives you all summer to plan if you have some kind of variable rate strategy in mind, right? So if you need to sample in the spring for that reason, by all means, go ahead and start doing that. But when you switch, stay on the spring track. And the reason is because you can get a lot of potassium out of corn residue over the winter, and that can change your potassium levels reasonably drastically from fall to spring. So soil sampling is really about tracking where you're going, and sampling in the fall if you're going to sample in the fall, or the spring if you're going to sample in the spring. Well, make sure that you keep on track with where you're going, tracking where you're headed.
So type of soil sampling, is composites better than grids? Are grids better than composites? Should we be doing it by soil type?
Yeah, that's where it could get into a lot of detail.
30-minute
session. There are definitely places and reasons to do 2.5 acre grids for sure, okay? But keep in mind that a 2.5 acre grid sample isn't the right sampling strategy for every acre. I'll give you a couple examples, right? So you think about river bottom soils, just as an example. You have sandy areas, heavy clay areas. Well, if you were to grid sample, and let's talk about potassium specifically on grid sampling, you would find that these sandy soil types are going to be really low in potassium, and that's because they're leaching potassium. So if you were to make a variable rate recommendation based on potassium level in a field like that, you're going to be dumping all kinds of potassium on these sandy soils, and you're never going to change anything. So that would not be a good place to use.
You know what would be good for that? Exact strips.
Exact strips would be good for that, but also that might be a place where you want to do soil type or zone sampling, where you focus your sampling strategy on those different soils that have a dramatic impact on fertility levels.
So what you're saying is if you have some really extreme soil types, especially as you move around these river bottoms, maybe those soil type sampling would be more beneficial.
Correct.
For you.
Okay, we can go into north central Iowa where there's a lot of naturally high pH soils. In north central Iowa, you're going to find that the P levels on those high pH soils are always going to be really low. And you're never going to be able to build those. So using a variable rate 2.5 acre grid strategy in that environment might not be the best strategy. In that environment, you might want to focus on zoning by those different soil characteristics, right? So it's not, grid sampling can be very highly advantageous, particularly when it comes to things like pH, right? Liming. And so we know there's been some really good work done at Iowa State that shows that just the cost savings from applying lime where you need lime can pay for the grid sampling on its own, right? So there's definitely a place where, grid sampling makes sense. At the same time, I think that grid sampling and variable rating off of those grid samples has been oversold and overabused in some cases, particularly for P and K. Because, the idea is that, well, if we can make a map, and the map is supposed to be a prediction of how P and K levels change throughout the field.
Right.
But it's a prediction, and it's a pretty map. And we all have to understand that just because the map says what it says doesn't mean that that truly reflects the amount of variation that's in the soil. And so I've done studies looking at this. I've done 10 acre grids. I think we went down to 5 acre grids, or maybe it was 4.5, down to 2.5 acre grids, down to 1 acre grids. And the soil test, or the fertilizer recommendation changed drastically from the 10-acre grids all the way down to the 1-acre grids, right? So that means or suggests that the 2.5-acre grids really didn't reflect the variability in the P and K in the field, right?
So this
At the
is probably
same time, when you look at pH in that same study, pH did not change. The liming recommendation did not change that drastically from the 10-acre grids to the 1-acre grids. Some, but once you got down to below the 2.5-acre grids, the liming recommendation never changed. And that's because soil pH doesn't change drastically from spot to spot to spot in the field. So we can accurately predict changes in soil pH with 2.5-acre grids.
Yeah, you can see that when you look at sample maps. You can usually see that feathered pattern as you move away from here in Iowa, the graveled roads.
Yep.
You can usually see.
Yep.
So that was a lot.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. That's what I was going to tell you. That was a lot. So what's one or two things that you want to tell a farmer then, after all, if they're still on and listening after all that?
I would say that grid sampling, it's a tool, right? Soil sampling is a tool. And you have to think, does this make sense for this field or my operation? And I think that's where we could get into a lot of details of helping people understand where it does and doesn't make sense in a much longer discussion. But I would think, does soil sampling scheme A, B, or C fit my farms or fields? Which one best fits?
Well, thanks, Dr. Jake, for that information. I'll let you get back to working on your planter. I see you've got that in the shop now. I know you're ready to go. The door's open.
We're not ready to go. We're a long way, but we're preparing to get ready to go.
Not very often is the door open in February, but this is pretty great weather that we're experiencing. So hopefully all you have your shed doors open at home, and hopefully we see you again next week.
Stay in the know with Liqui-Grow.